Welcome back to Imagine If. I'm your host as always, The Butler. If you are new to the channel, welcome. In today's show of real versus fake scary stories, I'll be telling a scary story about a Catholic church. It will be up to you, the viewer, to decide if this story is true or if it's completely made up from my creative imagination. I will tell you at the end of the show if the story was true or false. Are you ready to play? The Catholic Church. My name is Dwayne. I was born and raised Catholic on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, but me and my family moved to Los Angeles 16 years ago. We didn't move willingly, but we moved because we were forced to. After attending a Sunday morning service at a local Catholic church, we had been members for generations. We had no idea what was about to happen that morning, but what did happen still haunts us to this day. Me and my family are a part of the local church, as I mentioned earlier, and we have been for generations. Every Sunday morning, we would arrive at the church 2 hours before services started to help set up for the day. The morning started like every other morning. Everything was normal. It was fall season, and we arrived there at about 7 a.m. I was head of the youth program at church, and on this particular day, the kids were actually visiting a different church that was about 3 miles away from our current church. Before services started, it was my job to be the usher to help everyone find a seat. As people were coming into the church, I noticed many of them were not normal members. And by many, I mean maybe 20 or so were fresh new faces that I don't think I've ever seen before. About 10 or 15 minutes before our services started, we seemed to be having a power outage of some sort. Lights would go off for maybe 7 or 10 seconds or so, and then they would come right back on. Our priest at the time was not feeling very well that day. He started the services, but took several breaks during the first 20 minutes or so. The last break that he took, unfortunately, was not willingly. As he was giving the sermon, he passed out cold while standing at the altar. Everybody in the church rushed to the altar to see what had happened. Once they reached him, he had completely lost consciousness and was breathing very, very slow. One of the new faces that joined the church ran to the altar before anyone. She was a woman in her mid-20s or so, I would say. She had long black hair. She claimed that she was a nurse and for everyone to move back. And we did. Her name was Maria. She started to perform CPR on the priest. It did not work. Unfortunately, the priests that have been at this church for many, many decades had died. And believe it or not, that's when things began to get extremely spooky. It seemed to be the moment the priest took his last breath, everyone in the church cell phones began to ring. Simultaneously, all of the electricity went out in the church. Everyone's phone was ringing at one time, and we all had the same caller ID. It read, Diablo. And for those who do not know the Spanish term Diablo, it's translated in English as devil. But even creepier, none of us could actually pick up the phone call. Every time we would try to pick up the phone or answer the phone, it would briefly accept the call, connect the call, and then go right back to ringing. Out of nowhere, Maria started to scream very loudly, as if she was being tortured. Everyone's flashes on their phone went on Maria. and what we saw was extremely disturbing. Blood was streaming from her eyes. There were no cuts or bruises. She literally had bloodshot red eyes, and blood was streaming down her cheeks. She started to shake for a second, and then she went completely limp while still standing up. Her head was down, and her hair was covering her face. At this time, half of the church ran towards the exits, trying to get out, but all of the doors were locked. It seemed to be barricaded from the outside by a large concrete block or something like that. Everyone ran towards the back exit, but as they did, Maria was standing at the back door with her head still down and body limp. A longtime member named Manny asked Maria politely to please get out the way. Maria seemed to not even acknowledge Manny's request. She just stood there. Then he gently tapped her on the left shoulder to see if she was okay. And as he touched her, he seemed to be electrocuted. I know this sounds crazy, but that's the best way to explain this. He started to shake incredibly fast, and we heard the sound of voltage going through his body. After a few seconds, he fell to the ground, and his hands were charred. He also had severe burn marks on his cheeks. Maria looked up at everyone, and she had no blood on her face at all, but she did have jet black eyes. Everybody in the church began to pray. After 20 or 30 seconds or so, Maria, her body levitated. She levitated at least 3 or 4 feet off the ground. And as she levitated, she proclaimed that she was the true God. She began to speak in Latin, seemed to be very fluent. This went on for about 60 seconds or so, and she did return back to speaking English. And she said that she had taken the soul of the priest and that she would torture his soul in hell. She lowered her body from levitation and began walking slowly. She walked towards the priest. She looked down, and without touching him, the priest levitated himself into a standing position. He was standing there. His eyes were wide open, his mouth was closed, but his eyes were different. His eyes were all white. It was like a glowing white radiation coming from his eyes. The priest began to speak, and he said that he would be sacrificing his soul so that everyone in the ministry will be saved from going to hell. He said that he made a deal with the devil himself, and that if he did not sacrifice his soul, that everyone in the church today would be cursed for the rest of their lives, and upon death, their souls would be taken to hell. He apologized, and then he began to laugh hysterically. No pupils, just white eyes, looking at everyone in the church before collapsing and bleeding through every orifice on his body. He started to shake pretty aggressively, and then his body went limp. Maria then looked at us and told us that the priest's soul would be hers in hell. She also guaranteed that everybody in the church would be cursed. And at the same time that she said that, all of the lights in the church came back on. Maria started to cry. She looked at us as if she had no idea what was going on. She started to ask everybody what happened. She took a few steps backwards, and she looked up at the ceiling. She was smiling. She was smiling at the ceiling, and then her neck snapped as cracks from her neck bones echoed the church. She fell to the ground right next to the priest. The front and back entrance opened by itself as soon as Maria's body hit the floor. Everyone in the church ran to their cars using the front entrance, except for me and 12 other church members. We all ran towards the back door. I was the first to exit the back door, followed by 3 or 4 others. Once we got out, we heard screams coming from the church, and as we looked back, the church doors closed again. And that's when things got even creepier. The church itself had somehow become inflamed in fire. Firefighters arrived less than 10 minutes after the first blaze, but unfortunately, they were unable to contain the fire. The church itself burned for roughly 5 hours. Once the fire was contained, police officers and detectives had absolutely no evidence of any human bodies in the building. It is highly unlikely and almost scientifically impossible for there to be no traces of a body. The bodies of the priest and Maria were never found. Again, there would have been some type of remains from the body. Clothing, bones, something. There was nothing. How was this possible? The priest himself wore tons of jewelry. Real gold, real silver. There should have been some type of traces. Since that day, I have not spoken to any of the church members. In fact, I have not even been to church since then. Thank you guys so much for watching today's show of Real versus Fake Scary Stories. This one was a tough one. How do you think you scored? Do you think this story was true? Or was it 100% made up from my creative imagination? If you thought that this story was false, you're wrong. This story actually took place. I'll see you guys on the next show of Real versus Fake Scary Stories.